And good morning, good morning, good morning. How's everybody doing today? It's good to see everybody. I'm coming to you without my microphone on today. Go ahead and give me a quick sound check. Can everyone hear me well enough? Can you hear me well enough? Good morning, Sarah. Good morning, Eva, Anna. Good morning, Trevor, Rasha. Good to see everybody today. Hopefully my sound is coming through today. Thanks, Melody. It's good to see you. Hope everybody's coming to webinar tonight. Remember, we've got webinar at 8 p.m. tonight. Cool. Okay, very good. Okay, so the sound is coming through. Is that Rasha? Is that you saying that the sound is good? Hopefully everybody can hear me. Okay, looks like we've got some people on. A couple people dropped off. Well, it's good to see everybody. All right. Let's go ahead and, all right, fantastic. Good. That's what I want to hear. Let's go ahead and get started today. Okay. Uh-oh. What in the world? What in the world? Wrong slide deck up. What? Hold on just a second. Add files. Chapter 6A. There we go. Better. Okay. There we go. All right. Better. Excited for this week. Wow. Well, I'm glad to hear that, Melody. All right. So here we go. So today I'm gonna introduce you to the behaviorist perspective. We're gonna talk a little bit about classical conditioning, and then we're gonna talk a little bit about phobias and little Albert today and how to treat phobias. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so if you remember the first week of class, I was talking to you a little bit about the early perspectives in psychology. We talked about cognitive psychology. I talked about the psychodynamic perspective, and we talked about the behaviorist perspective. Um, the behaviorist, you can't actually be per se a behaviorist psychologist. That's not a subfield. There are variations that use the word behavioral, but in terms of just being a behaviorist psychologist, that doesn't really exist anymore. Instead, what we can say is that behaviorism is a way of looking at the human being that focuses on how the environment shapes human behavior. Okay, so if you remember, we talked about nature and nurture earlier in this semester, and we talked about nurture in chapter 4 when we talked about maturation, genetic maturation of the nervous system. I talked to you about myelination and critical periods, and we talked about all these things that have to happen at certain times as the human being unfolds. We're going to focus on a different aspect of human change. We're going to talk about learning. That is how the environment shapes the human organism. And we're going to talk about this concept called learning. And if you look at the definition that I have right here, I'm going to say this week that learning represents a relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of experience. All right. Now, I want you to notice two things. Number one is the word behavior. Instead of using something like understanding, acknowledging, believing, we're not going to use any of those mentalistic concepts. Instead, I'm going to talk about a permanent change in behavior and a relatively permanent change in behavior. Things that can be learned can be unlearned. And it's a change in behavior that occurs as a result of experience. All right. So, two things that the behaviorists focused on. They focused on how our environment changed and how the change in our environment would affect our behavior. Okay. Now, your book's sort of going to talk about different types of what we call learning. They're going to talk about non-associative, associative, and what we will call watching others. We're going to focus for this week on the middle part, associative learning, okay, which is learning to put two things together in your environment. And then next week, when we talk a little bit about the cognitive perspective, we're going to talk about observational learning and modeling and other ways. All right. So, behaviorism was interested in associative learning. Associative learning. Now, associative learning is just making a link between two pieces of information. So, learning that when you hear that noise, you're going to feel this particular pain. When you see that person, you're going to get this particular outcome. Learning how to associate things in your environment. And this is sort of, if you will, the focus of behaviorism. Now, it all starts with this fellow named John Watson. And you can think of, and he had a certain set of beliefs for how we should best study the human being. If you remember, I talked to you in chapter 1 and I suggested to you that from about 1850 to about 1940, psychologists were trying to figure out what the best way to study the human being would be. And John Watson was a proponent of what we call the behaviorist perspective. And here's sort of the beliefs that this guy, John Watson, supported. Number one, he suggested that all human functioning is learned through environmental experience. Now, behaviorists didn't put too much stock in nature or maturation or development. Instead, they focused on environmental experiences. So, according to John Watson, we can make a model of the human being that explains how that human being behaves by looking at how that human being is shaped by their environment. So, the first belief of John Watson was that environment was king. In fact, he even suggested give me a couple of 2-year olds well adjusted in my own world to bring them up in, and I can turn these children into anything. He thought the reason that I'm a psychologist is because of my environment. The reason that some of you work at grocery stores is because of your environment. If you like the color red, it's because of your environment. If you like eating steak or don't like eating vegetables, it's because of your environment. All behavior, according to behaviorists, can be explained by looking at the environment they find themselves in. So that's one of the major behaviorist beliefs. Now, along with this theory of how human beings develop, they also had a preference for a certain type of method. All right. Now, if you remember in chapter 1, I suggested to you that the major obstacle to birthing psychology as a science was demonstrating that the mind could be measured, right, and that the mind behaved systematically. Well, this belief wasn't set in stone, and in 1900, this guy, John Watson, thought, again, he still continued to believe that you could not measure the mind. And so the behaviorists believed that mental functioning could not be studied scientifically and that we must focus on things that can be observed, which is a human being's behavior. All right. And in fact, that's how they got the nickname. Like most nicknames, they didn't pick it, it was bestowed on them. And people said, hey, look at those guys there. All they're doing is studying human behavior. They're just those behaviorist kinds of guys. So, along with this belief that the environment was what shaped our behavior, they believed that the only way you could truly understand a human being was by looking at their behavior. All right. So all human being. So in order to learn about human beings, you need to look at their environment and you need to look at their behavior. Those were sort of the two core beliefs of the behaviorists. Now, these behaviorists did a ton of research using animal models, what we would call animal models, So John Watson, B.F. Skinner, all of these, Clark Hall, all of these famous behaviorists used animals in their research. So they wanted to find out, what can you teach a pigeon? What can you teach a dog? What can you teach a rat? And the goal of these psychologists was to demonstrate that you could teach very complex behaviors to pigeons, dogs, rats, and other animals. So if I could teach a dog to look like it was reading, what would that say about how human beings learned reading? If I could teach a pigeon to type or to push a grocery cart, that might allow me to suggest that maybe human beings learn the same ways. So these psychologists developed their theories by studying animals. And what they learned in animals, they suggested applied to people. And they also, if you will, had a philosophy that we're going to talk about on Thursday, which was elucidated by a fellow named B.F. Skinner in the 50s, was that this idea that if you knew how to organize the world, you could create a perfect society. The difference in people's life outcomes is due to their environment. And so, if you shape the environment properly, if you create the proper environment, people will always turn out well. Okay? And so, that was sort of the belief of this philosophy. Now, these people grew up in a contrast to what we will call the eugenics movement. We're going to talk a little bit about the eugenics movement later on in this semester, but the eugenics movement believed that people were born with qualities that made them either good or bad, useful or useless. And eugenics was a policy here in the United States that existed from the 1900s up until almost 1970, where people were sterilized because they weren't believed to have good genetic qualities. Now, the behaviorists did not believe that, and they said that the reason that we have crime, the reason that we have poverty, the reason that we have drug abuse is not because people are genetically fallible, but because the environment has shaped them to do drugs, to steal, to not work, to engage in violent behavior. So these behaviorists really believe that if we understood the environment and how it shaped people's behavior, we could A, identify the causes of poverty and bad behavior, and B, we could eliminate the causes of poverty and bad behavior. And so now, behaviorism as a modern perspective has a set of tools and a toolkit that helps us to adjust people's behavior by adjusting their environment. You talk about this in the police academy now. Ooh, what do you talk about in the police academy, Trevor? I'd be interested in hearing. Go ahead and type in a comment and let me know what you're talking about. So, y'all talk about classical and operant conditioning. Is that what you're talking about? Or are you talking about this belief that environment shapes people's behavior? That's an interesting question. Now, there are two ways in which your book is going to focus on how human beings acquire behavior. By talking about behavior acquisition, that's another fancy word for talking about learning. We say the organism acquires the behavior. If you can read, you have learned how to read, you have acquired that behavior. So, the behaviors talk about how human behavior is acquired, and they focused on two basic models: classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And that's going to be the focus of this week's lecture. So if you look over here on the far right side of my chart, I've got the types of learning that we're going to focus on: associative learning, right? And there are two models of associative learning: classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Human beings learn by understanding associations in their environment. When thing A happens, thing B happens. And so I learned that when I see thing A, I should expect thing B. That's classical conditioning, or learning by association. We're going to differentiate that with operant conditioning. Sometimes we learn by consequences. How many of you have ever done something and it turned out poorly and you said, wow, I'm not going to do that anymore? You have learned by operant conditioning. All right. So if you've ever trained a dog to go outside and use the bathroom outside, if you've ever trained a dog to sit, to fetch, to shake hands, if you've ever trained a dog to do something using a little treat, you have engaged in what we'll call operant conditioning. So according to behaviorists, all human being all human behavior is acquired by environmental forces, by forces that shape you in the environment. All right. These behaviors are more important than your thoughts, and these behaviors are learned in two ways: by associations we make in the environment and by consequences that the environment gives to us. Okay. Right. And Trevor, so you're talking about classical and operant conditioning. Okay, so you learned that in your police force, and you see that to use this from a law enforcement standpoint. Absolutely. And in fact, your goal most of the time, Trevor, is going to be to adjust people's behavior. That guy is being drunk and hanging out in front of this bar. It's time for him to go home. This person is doing this. It's time for them to quit doing that. Yes, absolutely. One of the most important things that you can do as a law enforcement officer is understand the basic bedrock of behaviorism. Is this why when you start hanging out with certain people a lot that you pick up their behaviors and mannerisms? Absolutely, Courtney. Absolutely. If you go out and your friends are using a particular type of app on their phone, right? And they all look at you and say, why aren't you using this app? You'll feel the pressure to use that. As soon as you download and start using the app, your friends say, cool, Courtney, you're a cool person. And so they reinforce that behavior. If you join a certain app, all of your friends will connect with you and you can then talk to them. They are rewarding that behavior that you are engaging in. Absolutely, Courtney. Your friends and your environment. Your friends reinforce your behavior, your parents reinforce your behavior. You know, the government uses tax incentives to reinforce your behavior. So the government will give you a tax deduction if you put money in a retirement account. The government is trying to shape your behavior by providing rewards in your environment. So, tax laws, laws that we use to govern our behavior, the way your friends act, the way your parents treat you, what I do here in school, all of these use either classical conditioning or operant conditioning in an attempt to change your behavior, Courtney. I want you to come to this class every day. So I make funny jokes when you get here. You come to class, you laugh, and you have a good time, and you say, wow, that guy Chris is so funny. Well, I've rewarded you for coming to my class. If you think about it, on the Wednesday webinar, I will give you extra credit if you come to my Wednesday webinar. I'm trying to, in a sense, shape and change your behavior. So, Courtney, behaviorism, the reason that behaviorism is still so powerful is because everything we do in our world is affected by the way other people treat us when we engage in particular behaviors. Yes, great idea, Courtney. Okay, now, the, the first, the first real big theory was developed by this fellow named Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist, right around the turn of the 20th century, the early 1900s. Now, here's the crazy thing: Ivan Pavlov was not a psychologist. Ivan Pavlov was actually a physiologist, and he was studying digestion. In fact, his work in digestion was so good that Ivan Pavlov won a Nobel Prize for his work in digestion in the early 20th century. But he realized that he discovered that his dogs were screwing his experiment up, um, because they were salivating at the wrong time. Now, in his research, what he would do is he would cut and put tubes into a dog's salivary gland. He would then put food powder, meat powder on the dog's tongue. And when the dog would salivate, he'd measure the amount of salivation that was produced by the dog. And he measured all the factors that affected how much a dog salivated. Right? Now, can anybody tell me why do we salivate? Does anybody know why we salivate? Does anybody know why we salivate? What is the function of saliva? I'm going to go ahead and wait for that in the chat bar right here. But one of the things that he discovered was that his dogs were screwing up the experiment because they would start salivating too early. When the experiment started, the dogs wouldn't salivate till he put the meat powder on their tongues. But after a while, the dogs would start salivating when they saw the person in the white lab coat who brought the meat powder to them. After a while, the dogs would begin to salivate when they heard the person in the white lab coat opening the door to the laboratory. And so these dogs were salivating at the wrong time. There you go. Melody and Logan, my good anatomy and physiology students. Absolutely. Saliva aids in the digestive process. It helps you to swallow more easily, and it actually begins to break the food down. Now, you may or may not know this, but salivating is a reflex response. You know, a reflex, some sort of behavior or reaction you have that you don't have to think about, that's automatically caused by some sort of stimulation. So if you've ever been to the doctor, you know how they make you put your knee up here and they hit you with a hammer and your knee kicks out? That's a reflex behavior. If you've ever been to the optometrist and they do that puff of air where they blow in your eye and your eyeball automatically blinks, that's a reflex response. And reflex responses are simple biological responses to environmental stimulation. It turns out that salivation is a reflex response. When you smell something tasty, you automatically begin to salivate. That is a reflex response. You do not have to learn that. And so Ivan Pavlov was studying this reflex response called salivation. And what he found was that the dogs began demonstrating this reflex response to things that shouldn't cause the reflex, and environmental cues not related to food. And he realized that he was demonstrating something he called reflex learning. Now, we're going to call it classical conditioning, but at the time, Ivan Pavlov said, wow, these organisms, these animals are learning a reflex response. And so classical conditioning starts with a reflex response. All right. When you hear a loud noise, you jump and you're scared. That's a reflex response. Puff of air, your eye blinks. That's a reflex response. Smell something tasty, that's a reflex response. And what he found was that you could associate something in the environment with that reflex response, and it would elicit that reflex response. So what he did was he used a metronome. And so if you look at this chart right over here, what you'll notice is sort of how this thing worked. Now, I'm going to explain something to you that makes complete sense. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mess it up by adding labels, something that makes complete sense to you, okay? So we're going to try to learn these labels, but don't get hung up. It always seems confusing at first, but I swear to goodness, it is really not that difficult. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and switch to my whiteboard right here, and we're going to work through this chart you see over here on the left. Okay, Logan Phillips. Logan Phillips had a question and I did not see it. What was your question, Logan Phillips? Logan, good morning. He says, so are some people more influenced by others' behavior and some who are more influenced like to have a personality more likely to spread versus someone that is more likely to have a personality more like to be influenced? Um, are there leaders and followers? Uh, yes, Logan. Yes, there are. There are personality differences that would affect these. That is a great question. Yes, yes, yes. And when we get to chapter 12, we're going to talk about personality differences. However, what I'm going to suggest to you, Logan, is that a behaviorist would answer that question a little bit differently than me. A behaviorist would say maybe, but all animals respond to environmental cues, all human beings. So a behaviorist wouldn't put as much stock in individual differences as you and I do. So you asked me that question, I say absolutely. A behaviorist would say, yeah, well, the environment is more important. That's a great question, Logan. That's a great question. And that's sort of one of the philosophical questions that behaviorists and non behaviorists develop. Are there individual, unique differences that are more important than the environment? Behaviorists would say, would be less likely to endorse that point of view than would someone like me. Great question. Great question. All right, so let's go to the whiteboard here for just a second. Hopefully everybody can see my whiteboard here. Okay, and let me adjust this just a little bit. All right, so here's the deal. If you remember, when he put food powder on the dog's tongue, and I misspelled powder, the dog would salivate because of food. Okay, this right here is a reflex response. This is a reflex response. Does that make sense? This is a reflex response. You don't have to learn this. So whenever he put the food powder, so this is what he called an unconditioned stimulus, and this is what he called an unconditioned response. An unconditioned stimulus means unlearned. If it's unconditioned, you don't have to learn it. So a food powder would cause the dog to salivate. Does that make sense, everyone? This is a reflex response. When he put food powder on the dog's tongue, the dog would salivate. All right, reflex response. Totally unlearned. The dog did not have to learn this. But then what he would do is he would play the metronome. Does everybody know what a metronome is? It's one of those timekeeping things that musicians use. It goes tick, 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 tick. It sort of, in a sense, keeps time. And so what he would do is he would play a metronome right before the meat powder. He would play it right before the meat powder. He would play the metronome, then he would put the meat powder on the dog's tongue, and the dog would salivate. He would play the metronome, then he would give the dog meat powder, and the dog would salivate. And every day he would come in, he would play the metronome right before he gave the dog food powder, and then the dog would salivate to the meat powder. And he called this a neutral stimulus. A neutral stimulus. He called it neutral because it didn't do anything. If you played the metronome to the dog to begin with, it wouldn't cause the dog to do anything. But he would pair this neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. Play the metronome, put the food powder on the dog's tongue, the dog would salivate. And he did that a bunch of times. And then you know what happened? He played the metronome, And then the dog salivated, and he didn't put the meat powder. He played the metronome, and the dog salivated to the metronome. Okay? Can anybody tell me why the dog salivated to the metronome? Why? Why did that happen? Why did that happen? Go ahead and type an answer in here. Okay. The answer is the dog began to associate the metronome with the food powder. And so he began to call this a conditioned stimulus, conditioned because it's learned. And he said that the dog salivated to the metronome. This was now the conditioned response, right? So he played the metronome, gave the dog the food powder, and the dog would salivate to the food. Play the metronome, give the food powder, the dog would salivate to the food. If he did that 5 times in a row, he could just play the metronome and the dog would salivate on its own. This was learning has occurred. Learning has occurred. All right? And this is what we call classical conditioning. Classical conditioning. All right? Now, check this out. I want to give you guys an example of how that works in my house. Check this out. I had this amazingly weird reaction the other day. Okay? Exactly. Deerica is got the best answer. Rasha, you're right because he said experience. Melody, he associated with being fed. And Deerica Jackson because every time he heard the sound, he thought he was getting food. All 3 of those are, and Nicole, absolutely. All 4 of you are absolutely correct. Let me give you this crazy story, all right? In my house, at the Roddenberries, house, Friday night is Domino's night. Now, here's the deal, folks. I cook and do most of the cooking in my family's house. My wife has this hard job. She's a hotel manager. She's gone. She stays late every night. So guess who cooks Monday through Thursday? Me. You know what I mean? But on Friday night, I am absolutely done with cooking. So at the Roddenberry house, Friday night is Domino's pizza night, right? And we order from the same Domino's, and there's this kid named Clay who brings my pizza. And here's the deal. When I smell pizza, I salivate. Okay? Now, smelling pizza is what we call the unconditioned stimulus, and me salivating is called the unconditioned response. All right? Does that make sense? Now, here's the crazy thing. Every Friday night, Clay stops at my house and he rings the doorbell. Ding dong. I say, hey, Clay, how are you doing? I smell the pizza. I begin to salivate. Every Friday night, ding dong. Hi, Clay, how are you doing? I smell that pizza. I begin to salivate, right? And so every Friday night, maybe I will try Donato's, Trevor, but every Friday night, my doorbell rings about 6:30. It's Clay. He gives me a pepperoni pizza, and I begin to salivate because that pizza smells so good. Clay, smell pizza, I salivate. Next Friday night, I see Clay, I smell pizza, I salivate, right? Every week I see Clay, I smell pizza, I salivate. I ran into Clay at the convenience store last week. And you know what happened when I saw Clay? Do you want to know what happened when I saw Clay? I could not believe it. I saw Clay and my mouth began to water. Can you believe that? I salivated when I saw Clay. All right? Can you explain to me what happened? Clay is now a conditioned stimulus, and this is now the conditioned response. The conditioned response. Okay? So, in a sense, I was conditioned to salivate when I saw clay. Absolutely. And so the crazy thing was, I saw clay and suddenly I'm hungry for pizza. Now, this is what's called classical conditioning. We learn how to associate these environments, these neutral stimuli, with reflex responses, and then these neutral stimuli begin to elicit the reflex response. This is what we call classical conditioning. Now, what uh, uh, what um, what what uh, Ivan Pavlov found was that you could even take a conditioned response and use it as the reflex to create a new conditioned response. Check this out. So, uh, food powder, salivate, and you can associate the metronome with the food powder, metronome, food powder, salivate, and then after a while, the metronome would cause the salivation, right? This is called classical conditioning, right? Right? And so the metronome is what we would call the conditioned stimulus, and this is now the conditioned response. The food powder is the unconditioned stimulus, and salivating to the food powder is the unconditioned response. You could then take this metronome and you could condition another behavior. So he would then ring a bell, play the metronome, the dog would salivate. He would ring a bell, do the metronome, and the dog would salivate. And after a while, the dog would salivate to the bell. He called this higher order conditioning. Okay? Higher order conditioning. You could actually use a classically conditioned response to condition another response, right? And so the point that B.F. Skinner and those people wanted to make was the fact that our behavior and our preferences can be classically conditioned. If you think about it, how many of you have a class that you are taking right now that you absolutely hate? That you absolutely hate, right? Is it because the material is horrible, or is it because the teacher makes the material horrible? So think about this. Here's the way how to make students like psychology class. Here's what I do. So, uh, students, I make jokes. And you know what? People laugh at jokes, right? And so what I do is while I'm teaching psychology, I make jokes and people laugh at jokes. I teach psychology, I make jokes, people laugh at jokes. Now, when you make a joke, that's the unconditioned stimulus. And when people laugh at the joke, that's an unconditioned response. But what I do is I make psychology class fun. So you hear about psychology, you hear about jokes, and you laugh at the jokes. After a while, you're going to say, psych is fun, right? That is the conditioned stimulus, and this is the conditioned response. Okay, do you see what I'm doing? Because I paired psychology with a fun time. You laugh and have a good time, and after a while, you like psychology because it's fun. Does that make sense? Hold on just a second. Looks like we've got a user. Bye bye, whoever you are. And you're gone now. Okay. So in a sense, that's how you can teach somebody to like uh, a particular area of psychology, right? So let's go back to our PowerPoint presentation. So this is what I want you to get. The reflex is the root of classical conditioning. What we do is we learn to associate neutral objects with the reflex response, and those neutral objects begin to elicit the reflex response. That's called classical conditioning. And you can take a learned response and use it and build on it to create another classically conditioned response. He Pavloved himself to feed a dog. Ha 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 ha. Yeah, I had to boot the Russian guy out of the class, Logan. All right. Now, here's the thing. John Watson, Ivan Pavlov was very successful in demonstrating that you could classically condition a response to any neutral environmental cue. And John Watson, when he came along, he was very impressed by B.F. Skinner's work. And he said, you know what? I think that this can be used to explain how people develop different things like phobias and other fears. Now, in 1900, the United States was undergoing its first mass industrialization, and there were a lot of problems that occurred as a result of millions of people moving to the city. Drug use, crime, poverty, prostitution, all the social ills that occur in a big city. And people were asking, why does this happen? Now, the eugenics said, you know what, it's because some people's genes and DNA is bad, and those people need to be removed from our world. John Watson said, I don't think so. I think people learn their bad behavior. And so he wanted to demonstrate this. If you look right over here, I have a quote by John Watson. Give me a dozen healthy infants, well formed in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to make any one at random and train them into becoming any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggar man and thief, regardless of their talents, pensions, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of their ancestors. All right. So John Watson was basically saying any of you can learn to be a doctor and to want to learn to like school. Any of you can learn to be a drug dealer or a thief or a master criminal. In John Watson's point of view, your outcomes in life were not dependent upon your genetic qualities, but instead were dependent upon the environment that you lived in. And so he created this really crazy experiment to demonstrate how correct he was. And he was so sure that this was going to turn out well that he even videoed it. And there is some silent video of John Watson from the early part of the 20th century training this infant, little Albert, to have a phobia. So little Albert was a very healthy 18-month-old toddler that was brought into John Watson's lab. Now, it turns out that human beings are not innately scared of rats. Okay, they're just like any other animal. And he took little Albert and would put a rat in front of him, and demonstrated that little Albert was not afraid of rats. He put white furry cats. He found that little Albert wasn't even afraid of those. He took a newspaper and set it on fire and showed it to little Albert, and little Albert wasn't scared of any of that stuff. He liked all kinds of little white furry animals, and he wasn't afraid of things in general. All right. So here's what John Watson did. He brought little Albert in, and he would show him the rat. Okay. Then he would make a ah, let me do it right here. He would show him the rat, make a loud noise, and you know what? Albert would cry because of the noise. All right. So he'd show him the rat. He'd make a loud noise, and Albert would be scared. All right, and he took a bar, a metal bar, and he would bang it right behind little Albert's ear. So he would show him the rat, which is a neutral stimulus. He would make a loud noise, which is the unconditioned stimulus, and little Albert would start crying because of the noise. That's the unconditioned response. And so what he did, he would show him the rat, make a loud noise, and Albert would start crying. And after a while, when Albert saw the white rat, he would cry. And this is a conditioned stimulus, and now this is a conditioned response. Albert has a learned fear. All right? Albert has a learned fear. All right? And so, after multiple pairings of the loud sound with the presentation of the white rat, little Albert cries anytime he is presented with the white rat. And here's what John Watson found. He found that anything that even reminded little Albert of the white rat made him cry. So little Albert became afraid of all white furry things, not just rats, but white furry cats, white furry dogs, a person with a big white furry beard. And so little Albert generalized his fear to all stimuli that reminded him of the object he was conditioned to fear. And so, in a sense, what John Watson demonstrated was that you could train a healthy infant to have a phobia. Now, how many of you have a fear of something? How many of you are afraid to swim? How many of you are afraid of this animal or that animal? How many of you are afraid of clowns or going to the circus? How many things have you learned to be afraid of? Here's the deal. John Watson shows us how human beings can learn to have these irrational fears we call phobias. We called phobias. Okay. Now, and we'll talk about that later. All right. Now, here's the deal. Uh, there is a treatment methodology that is used in clinical psychology. The phobia grew. Did he still keep the phobia? Yes, he did still keep the phobia. He absolutely kept the phobia. And the phobia, in a sense, grew because of stimulus generalization. Yes. And the phobia is long term. Absolutely. And phobias can actually grow a little bit. Oh, Amy brings up a great point. Could he then do the opposite and teach him to be unafraid? I'm glad you asked that question, Amy, because the technique, the behaviorist technique we call systematic desensitization, uses this same theory to unlearn a fear. So, if you can learn that fear, systematic desensitization is the technique which we use to unlearn a fear. Yeah, it is kind of messed up, isn't it? And it's the kind of experiment you could never do. You could do it in the early 20th centuries, but now there's no way an ethics board would ever let you do this to a child, right? Now, what we're going to talk about is something that's sometimes called systematic desensitization, or it's sometimes called counter conditioning, but it uses the same theory to unlearn that particular fear. So if a phobia is learned through environmental exposure, they can be unlearned the same way. And so what we do is we teach the student to achieve a positive emotional state, and then we pair the objects that provoke fear while helping the patient maintain this positive emotional state. All right? So here's what I would do. If you came into my clinical office and you said to me, Chris, I have a fear of clowns, coulrophobia, okay? I have a fear of clowns. Here's what I'd do. You'd come in and I would teach you how to relax, okay? So get in a positive state. All right? I would teach you a relaxation technique. All right, we learn that. And then what we do is put the feared stimulus while you're having the positive state. And after a while, the idea would you would no longer be afraid. Now, here's the deal. Here's the deal. If you present somebody, if you present somebody with their most feared object, there's no way they're going to be able to maintain the positive state. So what we have to do is we have to find out a way to present you with the feared object in such a small way that you can maintain this positive state. So if you came into my clinical laboratory, what I would do is we would learn how to relax. Get in a positive state, get in a positive state. And for the first two visits with me, we would learn how to achieve a positive state. Now, while we were learning about that, I would ask you to make what's called a fear hierarchy. I would tell you to list all the ways that you can be presented with the object, going from something that you think you could handle all the way to something that would cause you to lose your mind. So let's say you're afraid of spiders. You told me I could say, all right, what are the ways in which you could interact with a spider? You could say, well, I could think about a spider. I might look at a photo of a spider. I might look at a real spider in a closed box. I might actually hold that box with the spider. I might actually have the spider crawl on the desk. I might actually have the spider on a sleeve. And then I might have the spider on my bare arm. Now, if you think about it, those are different ways I can interact with the spider. Looking at a picture of a spider, though, is not nearly as scary as having a spider crawl on your bare arm. So what I've done with you is I've made up what's called a fear hierarchy, a set of interactions with the spider, going from something I think I could deal with all the way to something that scares the absolute hell out of me. And then what I do as a psychologist is I bring you in, we get you into your positive state, relax, get into a happy state. And once you are relaxed, I show you the photo of the spider. And the goal is for you to stay relaxed while you're looking at the photo. If at any time you start to feel uptight, you tell me and I take the photo away, right? And then we go back to your relaxed spot. We go back to your relaxed spot. All right. Now, once you get back to your relaxed spot, I bring the photo back out. And after a while, after several pairings of the photo of the spider with your relaxation technique, you'll be able to stay relaxed while you're looking at the photo of the spider. Once we feel confident in that, I then get the real spider in a closed box. We get into our relaxed spot, and I provide you the next stimulus that's a little bit scary. If you start to get uptight, you tell me and I take the spider away so you can get back to your relaxed spot because we don't want to pair fear with the spider. And so once you get back relaxed, I'll bring the spider back out in a closed box. And we practice remaining relaxed while we're looking at the spider in the closed box. Once we master that, we then move up the hierarchy. And the idea is what we want to do is move you up the hierarchy and pair these different presentations of the feared object with this new emotional response. And in a sense, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to classically condition a new emotional response to the object. Does that make sense? This is what we call systematic desensitization. Now, if you'll come to webinar tonight, what I'm going to show you is an example of exposure therapy. Exposure therapy. Now, doing systematic desensitization could take a ton of visits. It might take 10, 15, 20 visits. And that's kind of expensive, and your insurance company doesn't want to pay for that. So there's a different type of theory called exposure therapy. Exposure therapy. And what I do is I actually present you with the feared object, let you have that fear response, and then work you through that feared response. If you folks have ever gotten scared before by something, what you'll notice is that when you first see something scares you, You have this amazing fear response, but the longer you're with that object, the more bored you get and your fear goes down. And so I've got a video of a doctor that helps treat a woman who has a clown phobia. And what they do is they get together before the event and they talk about what she's going to feel and what's going to happen. What's going to happen when I show you the clown? She's like, I'm going to freak out. And he says, okay, is the clown going to hurt you? She's like, no. And he's like, but what's going to happen? She's like, but I'm going to be so afraid. And he's like, okay, but are you going to get hurt? And she's like, no. And so they do this little talk therapy, and then he brings her into a room, and a clown comes in the room, and she freaks out. And what he does is he talks her through her fear. He talks her through her fear. And her fear comes up, it peaks, and then her fear goes down. And what he finds is that when you pair something and let them get over their fearful experience, this exposure to the feared object can sometimes fight the phobia. I wish someone would classically condition you. You know what, Amy? We could work on that. I swear to God. And in fact, if you come to webinar tonight, I can show you how we can classically condition you not to be afraid of thunderstorms. We could do it. I swear to God, we could do it. All right. So what we're going to do tonight when we get to class, when we get to webinar, is we're going to work on learning how to use classical conditioning or operant conditioning. Actually, tonight we're going to do classical conditioning. Thursday night we're going to do an operant conditioning lab. But we're going to talk about how we might use this technique to help change the way we feel and the way we behave. So if there's a behavior you'd like to unlearn, if there's a fear or a phobia you'd like to unlearn, come to class tonight and we will practice, we will develop a protocol to help you get over your phobic response. Okay? You know, you got to see this video, Logan. You will absolutely find this incredibly shocking, surprising, funny, amazing if you come to class tonight, Logan. I hope you come so that I can show you how to treat coulrophobia, which is the fear of clowns. Okay, it is 9:57. Not freaking again. Kiroko, we can do that. We can absolutely do that. And I'll show you how to do that tonight. Okay? All right. Yeah, I know, right? That is kind of funny, Amy. All right, folks, have a great day. I hope you will make it to webinar at 8 o'clock. If you can't make it to webinar at 8 o'clock, I look forward to seeing you next Thursday in webinar. Have a great day. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me a text. Take care and have a great day. Bye.